I've been working the night shift in the ICU at City General for almost 8 years now. You see a lot of strange things when the hospital gets quiet and the fluorescent lights start humming in that eerie way they do after midnight. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I started seeing 3 months ago. It began with Mrs. Kowalski in room 312. 86 years old, admitted for pneumonia that had turned into something much worse. Her family had gathered during visiting hours, speaking in hushed Polish, holding her weathered hands. The doctors weren't optimistic. When families start camping out in the waiting room, we nurses know what that means. My first encounter with him happened during my 2 a.m. rounds. I was checking on Mrs. Kowalski, adjusting her oxygen levels, when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Right there in the doorway sat this massive German shepherd. Not just big, I'm talking huge. His coat was this deep brown and black, perfectly groomed, and he sat with military precision. What struck me most were his eyes. Dark, intelligent, almost human in the way they seemed to understand everything. I froze. We don't allow pets in the ICU, and I had no idea how a dog that size had gotten past security. But before I could call anyone, I blinked and he was gone. Just vanished. I stood there for a full minute, wondering if I was losing my mind from too many double shifts. The next night, same thing. 2 o'clock on the dot, there he was. Sitting in that exact same spot, watching Mrs. Kowalski sleep. This time I tried approaching him slowly, speaking in that gentle voice we use with confused patients. "Hey there, buddy. How did you get in here?" He looked right at me, tilted his head slightly, then simply wasn't there anymore. Like he'd dissolved into the shadows. By the third night, I was questioning my sanity. I even asked Janet, the other night nurse, to come with me during rounds. "Do you see anything unusual about room 312? I asked as we approached. She looked around, checked on Mrs. Kowalski, then shrugged. "Poor thing's struggling. Probably won't make it through the weekend." "Why?" The dog was sitting right there. Right behind Janet, close enough that she should have felt his breath on her neck. But she saw nothing. I started doing research. Called down to security, asked if they'd seen any dogs on the 3rd floor. They looked at me like I'd grown a second head. Checked the camera footage from the hallway outside room 312. Nothing. Just me standing there, apparently talking to empty air. But every night he was there. Always at 2 a.m. Always watching over Mrs. Kowalski with this protective, almost mournful expression. I began to look forward to seeing him, strange as that sounds. There was something comforting about his presence, like he was keeping vigil with me during those long, dark hours. Mrs. Kowalski passed on a Thursday morning at 6:47 a.m. I was holding her hand when she took her last breath, her family surrounding the bed. It was peaceful, the way we all hoped to go. As I was completing the paperwork, I realized something. I hadn't seen the dog that night. Curious, I went back to room 312 around 2 a.m. Empty. No mysterious guardian. Just shadows and the soft hum of medical equipment being cleaned for the next patient. I thought that was the end of it. Some sort of stress-induced hallucination brought on by watching too many people die. But then I was talking to Sandra from day shift about Mrs. Kowalski, and she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "Such a shame about her dog," Sandra said, updating patient charts. The family was heartbroken about that too. "What dog?" "Oh, you didn't hear?" Mrs. Kowalski had this German shepherd. Bruno, I think his name was. Massive thing, apparently. He was her service dog after her husband died. The family said she was absolutely devoted to that animal. My hands went numb. What happened to him? Hit by a car in our parking lot about 6 months ago. They rushed him to the emergency vet, but there was nothing they could do. Mrs. Kowalski never really recovered from losing him. The family thinks it's part of what made her health deteriorate so quickly. I stared at Sandra, my mind reeling. 6 months ago? Yeah, tragic really. They said she kept calling for Bruno even when she was barely conscious. Kept asking when he was coming to visit. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those intelligent brown eyes, the way he sat with such purpose and dignity. The way he'd appeared every single night until Mrs. Kowalski died, then vanished. I've worked in hospitals long enough to know that death isn't always the end of someone's story. But I never thought that applied to dogs too. Bruno had been Mrs. Kowalski's protector in life, and somehow, impossibly, he'd continued that job even after death. I still work the night shift in the ICU. Still do my 2 a.m. rounds. And sometimes when we have a patient who's struggling, who's alone and scared in those final days, I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. a tail disappearing around a corner, the soft click of claws on linoleum, the feeling of being watched by something ancient and protective. The other nurses think I'm crazy when I mention it, but I know what I've seen. And honestly, it gives me comfort knowing that even in death, love finds a way to keep watch over those who need it most. Some guardians never truly leave their post. Story 2. Working pediatric oncology isn't for everyone. I've been doing it for 12 years now, and people always ask how I can handle it, watching kids fight battles that would break most adults. The truth is, children are stronger than we give them credit for. They find joy in the smallest things, even when they're facing the unthinkable. But this story isn't about their strength. It's about something else entirely. It started about 4 months ago with Lily, a 7-year-old with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Sweet kid, loved to draw pictures of unicorns and rainbows despite everything she was going through. One morning during my rounds, she was sitting up in bed coloring when she looked up at me with those big brown eyes. "Nurse Indira, did you see the doggy last night?" I glanced around her room. No stuffed animals that looked particularly dog-like. "What doggy, sweetheart?" "The golden one. He was sitting right there." She pointed to the corner by the window. "He looked really sad, but he made me feel better when I couldn't sleep. I figured it was the morphine. Kids on heavy pain medication often see things that aren't there." I made a note to check with her oncologist about adjusting her dosage. But then Marcus, in the room next door, mentioned it too. 10 years old, brain tumor, sharp as a tack despite everything. "There's a dog that visits at night," he told me matter-of-factly during his vitals check. "Golden retriever, I think. My dad had one when I was little. This one's fur is all messy though, like he needs a bath." 2 kids, different medications, same description. I started paying attention. Over the next few weeks, more children mentioned the dog. Always the same details: golden retriever, matted fur, sad eyes. Always appearing at night when they couldn't sleep, which was often in pediatric oncology. The chemo, the pain, the fear, sleep doesn't come easy to these kids. What struck me was how none of them seemed scared. If anything, they talked about the dog like he was a friend. 8-year-old Aisha, who barely spoke after her cancer diagnosis, lit up when she described him. "He sits with me when I'm scared. He doesn't talk, but I know he understands." I started dismissing it as some kind of shared hallucination, maybe something in the water or a side effect of the new cleaning supplies. But these kids were on completely different treatment protocols. Different medications, different stages of treatment. The only thing they had in common was being unable to sleep. Then came the night that changed everything. I was pulling a double shift. One of our night nurses had called in sick, and we were short-staffed. It was around 3 a.m., and I was doing my rounds when I heard soft whimpering from Tommy's room. 6 years old, in for his second round of chemo after his cancer had returned. His parents lived 3 hours away and could only visit on weekends. I peeked in, expecting to find him crying, maybe needing comfort or pain medication. Instead, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. There, sitting beside Tommy's bed, was a golden retriever. Not a hallucination. Not a trick of the light. A real physical dog. His fur was matted and unkempt, hanging in clumps like he'd been caught in the rain months ago and never properly dried. But it was his eyes that got me. They were filled with such profound sadness, yet somehow gentle and knowing. Tommy had his little hand resting on the dog's head, finally sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. The dog looked up at me, and I swear I saw recognition there. Like he knew I could see him, and he was asking me not to interfere. I stood frozen in the doorway for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The dog never moved, never broke eye contact. Then slowly he seemed to fade away. Not disappear suddenly like in the movies, more like he was made of mist and was gradually dissipating. Tommy stirred, opened his eyes, and smiled at me. "Did you see him too, Nurse Indira?" "My doggy friend." I couldn't speak. Just nodded. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I went to the hospital archives and started digging through old records. If there was a dog somehow connected to this ward, there had to be a paper trail somewhere. I found it buried in incident reports from 2018. A therapy dog named Buster had been part of our pediatric program for 3 years. Golden retriever, specially trained to work with sick children. The reports described him as exceptionally intuitive and able to sense which children needed comfort most. The final report was dated October 15, 2018. Buster had been struck by a car in the hospital parking lot while his handler was loading equipment. The driver didn't see him in the early morning darkness. He was rushed to the emergency vet, but his injuries were too severe. What made my hands shake was the next part. The report noted that several children had asked about Buster for weeks after his death, particularly the ones who had trouble sleeping. The program was discontinued after that. Too difficult to replace such a special animal. I sat in that basement archive room, surrounded by dusty files, and finally understood. Buster hadn't left. He was still doing his job, still comforting frightened children in the middle of the night. Still carrying the weight of their pain in those sad, knowing eyes. I never reported what I saw. How could I? Instead, I started paying closer attention to which children mentioned the dog. Without fail, they were always the ones having the hardest time, the most scared, the most alone, the ones whose families couldn't stay overnight. Now, when kids tell me about their nighttime visitor, I don't dismiss it as medication side effects. I listen. And sometimes, when I'm working late shifts and the ward gets that particular kind of quiet that only comes at 3 a.m., I catch glimpses of golden fur in my peripheral vision. Buster is still here, still working. Still loving these children the only way he knows how. Some jobs, I guess, are too important to abandon. Even in death. Story 3. The ER at Downtown Memorial isn't like those clean, organized emergency rooms you see on TV. We're in the heart of the city, which means we get everything: gang violence, overdoses, car accidents, domestic disputes that end in bloodshed. I've been working trauma for 6 years, and I thought I'd seen every kind of hell this job could throw at me. I was wrong. The first time I noticed him, it was during a particularly brutal Friday night in August. 3 gunshot wounds came in within an hour, plus a multi-car pileup on the interstate. The kind of night where you're running on pure adrenaline and coffee, where the smell of blood and antiseptic becomes so thick you can taste it. I was working on a 19-year-old kid who'd taken a bullet to the chest. Wrong place, wrong time, caught in someone else's war. His vitals were crashing, and Dr. Martinez was fighting to keep him stable when I saw it. A shadow in the corner of Trauma Bay 3. Not just any shadow, the outline of something large and four-legged. For a split second, I could swear I saw a massive black dog sitting there, watching us work. Mastiff, maybe, with that distinctive broad head and powerful build. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing but empty space and medical equipment. The kid didn't make it. Coded twice on the table before we finally had to call it. As I was cleaning up afterward, that corner felt different somehow. Colder. Like something had been there and taken a piece of the warmth with it when it left. I didn't think much of it at first. Working trauma does things to your head: sleep deprivation, stress, witnessing trauma after trauma. Hallucinations aren't uncommon in this line of work. But then it happened again. And again. Always during the worst nights. Always in the corners of rooms where someone was dying or had just died. Always the same massive black shape, sitting with this eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. Other staff never seemed to notice, but I started paying attention to our patients' reactions. That's when things got really weird. Mrs. Chun, brought in after a massive heart attack, was barely conscious when the paramedics wheeled her in. But as we were losing her, she suddenly reached toward the corner where I'd glimpsed the shadow. Her lips were moving, trying to say something. I leaned closer to hear. "Big dog," she whispered. "Big black dog, he's waiting for me." She flatlined 30 seconds later. It wasn't an isolated incident. Over the next few months, I heard variations of the same thing from dying patients. "There's a dog here. Black dog in the corner. Why is that dog staring at me?" Always reaching toward empty spaces, always right before they slipped away. The thing is, these weren't delirious ramblings. Some of these people were completely lucid right up until the end. Sharp, aware, describing the exact same thing I'd been seeing, but trying to rationalize away. The dog, and I was becoming convinced it really was a dog, only appeared during the absolute worst cases. The ones where death wasn't just possible but inevitable. Overdoses too far gone to save. Trauma victims who'd lost too much blood. Terminal patients brought in during their final moments. I started keeping track. Not officially. That would have gotten me a mandatory psych eval, but in a small notebook I kept in my locker. Dates times patient outcomes. The pattern was undeniable. When the shadow dog appeared, people died. Every single time. The night that changed everything was in October. Multi-vehicle accident on Highway 95. Drunk driver plowed into a family of 4. The parents were DOA, but their twin daughters, maybe 8 years old, were still fighting when they arrived. We were working on both girls simultaneously. Sarah in Trauma 1, Emma in Trauma 2. Both critical, both touch and go. I was assisting with Sarah when I saw him again, clearer than ever before. He was enormous. Easily 150 pounds, with that distinctive mastiff build, broad chest, massive head, short black coat. But his eyes. God, his eyes were wrong. Not the warm brown you'd expect from a family dog. These were different. Ancient. Patient. Like he'd been watching people die for centuries and had made peace with it. He was sitting between the two trauma bays, perfectly still, head moving slowly back and forth like he was deciding something. Sarah's vitals spiked, then crashed. As the team worked frantically to bring her back, the dog's attention fixed on her. I watched horrified as he slowly stood and padded toward Trauma 1. That's when I did something stupid. Something that still keeps me up at night. I yelled at him. No, not her. She's just a kid. The entire trauma team looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Dr. Martinez actually asked if I needed to step out. But the dog looked right at me. Those ancient, patient eyes met mine, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. He sat back down, waiting. Sarah stabilized. Against all odds, her vitals came back strong. We got her to surgery and she pulled through. Her sister Emma made it too. Both girls survived what should have been fatal injuries. But that night, when I got home to my apartment, I found him waiting for me in my living room. Just sitting there on my couch like he belonged. Those same patient, terrible eyes watching me as I stood frozen in my doorway. What do you want? I whispered. He tilted his head, studying me. Then, without any sound of movement, he was gone. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've seen him everywhere. Reflected in windows when I'm driving home. Standing at the foot of my bed when I wake up in the middle of the night. Always watching. Always waiting. I've tried researching the hospital's history, looking for any connection to a large black dog. Nothing in the official records. But Jerry from maintenance, who's worked here for 30 years, told me something interesting when I asked him about it. You talking about the Reaper? He said, not even looking up from fixing a broken gurney. Yeah, he's been around forever. Used to belong to one of the ER docs back in the 90s. Dr. Patterson, I think. Brought that monster to work sometimes during night shifts. Dog got hit by an ambulance right outside the emergency entrance. Died instantly. What happened to Dr. Patterson? Jerry shrugged. Transferred to another hospital not long after. Couldn't handle working here anymore, knowing his dog died right outside. I don't know what I did that night when I interfered. Don't know what cosmic balance I might have upset by challenging something that's been doing its job for decades. All I know is that the dog is following me now, and I'm starting to understand what those dying patients felt when they saw him waiting in the corners. Some debts, I'm learning, have to be paid eventually. Story 4. Recovery is the hardest part. People don't realize that. They think once you survive the accident, the surgery, the initial trauma, you're in the clear. But those first weeks in rehabilitation? When you're learning to walk again, or use your hands, or accept that your body will never be the same. That's when the real fight begins. I've been working spinal injury rehabilitation at Mercy General for 9 years. I've seen construction workers break down crying because they can't tie their shoes. Athletes who'll never run again. Teenagers whose lives changed in a split second of bad judgment. My job is to help them find hope when hope feels impossible. But sometimes, I get help from an unexpected source. It started with Maria Santos, a 24-year-old who'd been paralyzed from the waist down in a car accident. Beautiful girl, had been training for the Boston Marathon before her world turned upside down. She'd been with us for 3 weeks and was struggling with the basics, transferring from bed to wheelchair, building upper body strength, accepting her new reality. She was having a particularly rough session with physical therapy when she first mentioned it. "Did you see that dog?" she asked me after her PT session, wiping sweat and tears from her face. I looked around the therapy room. "What dog, honey?" "Border Collie, I think. Black and white." He was right there next to the parallel bars while I was trying to stand. Kept looking at me like he was encouraging me to keep going. I glanced at Janet, our physical therapist, who just shrugged. We didn't have therapy dogs in our program. Budget cuts had eliminated that years ago. I figured Maria was seeing things. Depression and pain medication can do that. But then David, a 50-year-old electrician recovering from a spinal fusion, mentioned the same thing 2 days later. "Strangest thing," he said during his morning exercises. "Could have sworn there was a dog watching me during my workout yesterday. Border Collie, really well-trained looking. Just sat there the whole time, head tilted like he was studying my technique. Same description. Same breed. Same location, always in the physical therapy room. Over the next month, more patients started talking about the dog. Always during their most challenging sessions. Always described the same way: medium-sized border collie, black coat with white markings, incredibly focused and intelligent eyes. What struck me was how patients reacted to seeing him. Instead of being confused or frightened, they seemed encouraged. "He made me feel like I could do it," said 17-year-old Jake, who was relearning to walk after a diving accident. "Like he believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself." These weren't confused or medicated ramblings. These patients were sharp, articulate, describing detailed interactions. Some said the dog would move closer when they were struggling, as if offering silent support. Others mentioned how he seemed to nod approvingly when they completed difficult exercises. I started spending more time in the PT room, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever they were seeing. For weeks, nothing. Just patients working through their exercises, sweating and struggling, and occasionally glancing toward empty spaces with small smiles. Then came the night I decided to stay late to catch up on paperwork. It was around 9 p.m., well past normal therapy hours. The PT room was dark except for the security lighting, equipment neatly stored for the next day. I was walking past on my way to the nurse's station when I heard something that made me stop cold. The soft patter of footsteps. Not human footsteps, too quick, too light. Four-legged footsteps. I peered through the glass door into the PT room and felt my breath catch. There, weaving between the parallel bars and exercise equipment, was a border collie. Not translucent or ghostly like you might expect, solid, real, physical. His black and white coat was immaculate, his movements precise and purposeful. He was practicing. That's the only way I can describe it. The dog was moving through the exact same patterns our patients used during their sessions. Walking the length of the parallel bars, sitting and staying at specific spots, even approaching the exercise mats in the same sequence we used for floor work. As I watched, transfixed, he suddenly stopped and looked directly at me through the glass. Those intelligent brown eyes held mine for a long moment, and I felt like he was assessing me, deciding if I could be trusted with what I was witnessing. Then he simply trotted away, disappearing into the shadows near the back of the room. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the PT room door. The space was empty, but I could smell something. Not the usual antiseptic and rubber mat odors, but something else. Dog. The distinct scent of clean fur, and that earthy smell dogs carry even after a bath. And there, leading from where I'd seen him to the back exit that connected to the memorial garden, were wet paw prints on the linoleum floor. The memorial garden. I'd walked past it hundreds of times, but never really paid attention. The next morning, I went out there during my break and really looked around for the first time. It was a small, peaceful space with benches and flower beds, maintained by volunteers and patient families. Along one side was a row of memorial stones, patients and staff members who had passed away over the years. At the very end, almost hidden by overgrown rose bushes, was a smaller stone I'd never noticed. Scout, beloved therapy dog, 2015 to 2019. He never gave up on anyone. Below the inscription was a photo embedded in the stone. A border collie with black and white markings, sitting in the exact same pose I'd seen in the PT room the night before. I found Janet later that day and asked her about Scout. "Oh my God, Scout!" Her whole face lit up. "He was amazing. Worked with our patients for 4 years. I've never seen anything like him. It was like he could sense exactly what each person needed. Some patients he'd challenge, pushing them to work harder. Others he'd comfort when they were ready to give up." "What happened to him?" Her expression grew sad. "Cancer. It came on fast. He was only 4 years old. We tried everything, but..." She shrugged. The patients were devastated. Scout had helped so many of them through the worst periods of their recovery. We were going to get another therapy dog, but the program got cut before we could. "Where is he buried?" "Right here in the memorial garden." The patients insisted. Scout had given so much to this place, they wanted him to stay. That night, I went back to the PT room after hours. Sure enough, around 9 p.m., Scout appeared. This time I didn't hide. I opened the door and stepped inside. He looked at me calmly, tail wagging slightly. Not afraid, not aggressive. Just acknowledging my presence. "You're still working, aren't you, boy?" I whispered. His head tilted, and I swear I saw understanding in those brown eyes. He trotted over to the parallel bars and sat in the exact spot where patients usually began their walking exercises. Then he looked back at me expectantly. I understood. Scout wasn't just visiting. He was still on duty, still helping patients who needed him most, still offering the encouragement and support that had made him such an incredible therapy dog in life. Now, when patients mention seeing him, I don't dismiss it. I listen to their stories about the border collie who appears during their hardest moments, who seems to believe in their recovery even when they don't. Because some jobs are too important to abandon, and some hearts are too loyal to let death get in the way of helping others heal. Story 5. Working the night shift in a state psychiatric facility isn't exactly what I planned when I got into nursing. But life has a way of putting you where you're needed, not where you want to be. Riverside State Hospital houses some of the most troubled minds in the state. Patients who've been failed by every other system. People whose demons are too dark for regular hospitals to handle. The high-security wing is where they keep the violent ones. The patients who've hurt others, who might hurt themselves, who need constant monitoring and reinforced doors. It's not an easy place to work, but someone has to do it. These people are still human beings, even if their minds have taken them to very dark places. I've been doing overnight shifts here for 5 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the human psyche could produce. But nothing prepared me for what I started witnessing 6 months ago. It began with Marcus Webb, a diagnosed schizophrenic who'd been transferred to us after assaulting 3 orderlies at his previous facility. Marcus was big, 6'4", probably 250 pounds of solid muscle from his years as a construction worker before his mental health deteriorated. When he was having an episode, it took 4 security guards to restrain him safely. But one night, something changed. I was doing my hourly rounds when I found Marcus pressed against the back wall of his room, hands raised defensively, eyes wide with terror. Not the confused terror of a psychotic break. This was different. Focused. Like he was seeing something very real and very threatening. "Get him away from me," Marcus whispered, voice shaking. "Please, just get the white dog away from me." I looked around his room. Nothing there but standard psychiatric facility furniture. Bed bolted to the floor, small table, plastic chair. No white dog. No dog of any kind. "Marcus, there's no dog in here. You're safe." He shook his head frantically. "He's right there. White as snow, but his eyes. God, his eyes are red as blood. He keeps staring at me. Won't stop staring." I called for backup and administered his PRN medication. But even as the sedative took effect, Marcus kept his eyes fixed on that empty corner, whimpering about the white dog with red eyes. The strange thing was, Marcus stayed calm for the next 3 days. No outbursts, no violence, barely even raised his voice. It was the longest peaceful stretch he'd had since arriving at our facility. Then Jerome Patterson started talking about the same thing. Jerome was a different kind of dangerous, a diagnosed sociopath who'd been institutionalized after a series of increasingly violent crimes. Cold, calculating, completely without empathy. He'd never shown fear of anything or anyone during his 2 years with us. Until the night I found him cowering in his bathroom, absolutely terrified. "There's a dog in my room," he said, his usual swagger completely gone. "White dog with demon eyes. It won't leave me alone." Same description. Same terror. And just like with Marcus, Jerome's behavior changed completely after that. The aggressive posturing stopped. The constant threats and intimidation tactics disappeared. He became manageable. Over the next few weeks, more patients in the violent ward started reporting the same thing. Always the same description. A white dog with red eyes that would appear in their rooms and just stare at them. Always patients with a history of violence. Always patients who'd hurt others. And without exception, every single one of them became docile after these encounters. The rational part of my brain said it was some kind of shared delusion, maybe triggered by a new medication interaction or environmental factor. But the security footage told a different story. I started reviewing the recordings from the nights when patients reported seeing the dog. What I found made my blood run cold. The cameras showed patients backing away from empty spaces, clearly terrified of something. But more disturbing was their body language. These were violent, aggressive individuals, people who'd shown no fear of guards, orderlies, or other patients. Yet they were cowering like children, hands raised protectively, sometimes even begging for mercy. "Please don't hurt me," I heard Marcus say on one recording, talking to an empty corner of his room. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I did." Jerome, the sociopath who'd never shown remorse for anything, was on his knees in another video, actually crying. I know what I am. I know what I've done. Just, please don't look at me like that. These recordings were from different nights, different patients, but the reactions were identical. Grown men who'd terrorized others, reduced to terrified children by something only they could see. That's when I decided to dig into the hospital's history. Riverside State Hospital has been operating since 1892, and its records are extensive but poorly organized. I spent weeks in the basement archives, going through old incident reports, patient files, and administrative documents. What I eventually found made everything click into place. In 1987, there was a patient named Robert Chin, admitted for severe depression and suicidal ideation, but he had an emotional support animal, a white German shepherd named Ghost. Back then, the regulations were different, and Ghost was allowed to stay with Robert in a special wing of the hospital. Robert was getting better. The dog seemed to help with his depression, and his doctors were optimistic about his recovery. Until one night, when an orderly named James Valdez decided to teach the crazy patient a lesson. The incident report was buried deep in the files, marked confidential. Valdez had a history of abusing patients, verbal intimidation, physical roughness, stealing personal items. Management knew but looked the other way because staff was hard to find and harder to keep. The night it happened, Valdez cornered Robert in his room. Started beating him, calling him names, threatening worse if Robert reported it. Ghost tried to protect his owner, but Valdez had a knife. Both Robert and Ghost died that night. Robert from his injuries, Ghost from being stabbed multiple times while trying to defend him. Valdez claimed it was self-defense, said the dog went rabid and attacked. Without witnesses and with Robert dead, the story was accepted. But here's what really chilled me to the bone. The report noted that Ghost's eyes had a rare genetic condition called heterochromia. Instead of brown, his eyes were a pale, almost translucent blue that appeared red under certain lighting conditions. White dog. Red eyes. I found Valdez's employment record too. He worked at Riverside for another 3 years after the incident before transferring to another facility. Then another. And another. A pattern of short-term employment at various psychiatric hospitals across the state, always leaving under mysterious circumstances. The final entry in his file was from 1994. Found dead in his apartment, apparent heart attack. The coroner noted that he appeared to have died in extreme distress. Eyes wide open, face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Now I understand what I'm witnessing. Ghost isn't just haunting our facility, he's working. Still protecting the vulnerable, still standing guard against those who would hurt people who can't defend themselves. The patients who see him aren't random. They're all men with histories of violence, especially against those weaker than themselves. Marcus had beaten his elderly mother before his breakdown. Jerome had targeted homeless people. Every single patient who's encountered the white dog has a history of preying on the defenseless. And Ghost makes sure they remember what it feels like to be afraid. I still work the night shift in the psychiatric wing. But now when patients report seeing a white dog with red eyes, I don't dismiss it as a hallucination. I document their behavior changes, note their improved compliance, and remember that sometimes justice comes in forms we don't expect. Some protectors never abandon their post, even when their watch extends beyond the grave.